Americans are spending their savings and could run out of money this quarter, according to a study by the Federal Reserve. This doesn't mean the US economy is going to collapse overnight, but if you live in North America, your daily life will become more challenging. In today's video, we'll discuss the reasons Americans could run out of money, what the government is doing to address the issue, and what might happen in the coming months. Americans are struggling to keep up with their expenses. This is because the cost of living in the United States has surged in recent years due to inflation, which began rising in 2020 and reached 9.1% by mid-2022. Although it started to decrease, it has risen again in the last 2 months and is now at 3.7%. To measure inflation, the average change in prices of various products and services, such as food and electricity, is calculated. However, not all products are considered, especially those deemed non-essential for living, like a car, and their prices may change differently from inflation. Some examples of the impact of inflation include an 18% increase in rental prices in the US from 2020 to 2023. Housing prices are at historic highs, making it challenging for the middle class to afford a home, especially with mortgage interest rates exceeding 7%. The cost of maintaining a car, including repairs and regular maintenance, has increased by 30% since 2020. Gasoline prices have risen from $2.58 per gallon in early 2020 to $3.76 in August 2023. Even basic items like bread have seen a 46% price increase. The inflation rate, reported by the Federal Reserve, rose to 3.7% in August. While this is an average, specific product prices may have increased or decreased more. For example, energy prices, including electricity and gas, increased by 5.6% on average from July. The cost of transportation services rose by 10.3% against August 2022, affecting those who heavily rely on their cars. Overall, these price increases pose challenges, particularly for those with lower incomes. It's crucial to note that these problems wouldn't be as severe if salaries increased proportionally, but this is not the case in the US and many other countries. Since 2020, inflation has been much higher than wages, so Americans can buy fewer things over time. Despite a recent recovery, it is still far from the level it had at the beginning of 2020. If Americans have been losing purchasing power since 2020, how have they managed to maintain their standard of living? Essentially, they are using their savings or making purchases with credit cards, leading to the depletion of savings. Until 2020, savings were gradually increasing, reaching around $100 billion. However, when the pandemic hit, the US government started giving money to individuals and businesses to help them survive, assuming they might lose their jobs due to lockdowns preventing them from working. For example, the government paid $1,200 to millions of people to combat the economic impact of the pandemic, even when many of them might have been working remotely. This caused savings to skyrocket in 2020 and 2021. However, towards the end of 2021, and the beginning of 2022, inflation started to grow uncontrollably because the government had given so much money to people, creating a much higher demand than supply and causing prices to increase. This situation forced Americans to use their savings to maintain their lifestyles, resulting in savings dropping well below pre-pandemic levels. Another way to observe that Americans are saving less is through the personal savings rate, which is the percentage of income that people allocate to savings. Before the pandemic, savers could set aside about 9% of their income. During the pandemic, the rate surged to over 30% thanks to the government's financial assistance. However, it has now fallen to 3.5%. And if this trend continues, those currently saving will stop doing so. Combining decreasing savings and increasing debt, the situation could be dire for the average American. Since 2021, credit card debt has surged from $800 billion to over $1 trillion, now the largest in history. However, credit card debt is not the only problem. Given the high cost of higher education in the United States, many students resort to student loans to finance their studies. This debt now totals over $1.6 trillion, owed by about 43 million students. With the resumption of student loan payments, students will need to add $500 to their monthly expenses, considering the average monthly payment for a student loan is estimated at $503. Now, how does all this impact the US economy? If US consumers start buying fewer things, businesses will sell less. This could lead to layoffs or even closures. Since the government began providing money to people during the pandemic, the number of business closures had decreased as people were buying more and businesses were doing better. However, around mid-2022, this trend changed as the government had stopped providing money and people started having less savings. Since then, business closures have started to rise again. The less money Americans have in their pockets and the higher the inflation, the more businesses will go bankrupt. Despite these indicators suggesting that the US economy is heading toward a crisis, the government and some major banks insist that the economy is currently thriving and there is no risk of a crisis. They believe it will continue to grow in both 2024 and 2025. According to Goldman Sachs, one of the world's largest banks, the chances of a recession, when the country generates less money and unemployment rises, are now only 15%. However, not everyone is as optimistic as the Federal Reserve and Goldman Sachs, as the general public does not see a bright future for the country. According to a survey by Quinnipiac University, 71% of Americans described the economy as not so good or poor, and 51% said it is getting worse. The Federal Reserve survey, which asks Americans about their expectations for future prices, employment, and personal finances, concludes that they expect fuel prices to increase by 4.9%, food by 5.3%, healthcare by 9.2%, college education by 8.2%, and rent by 9.2%. Furthermore, surveyed individuals feel that the likelihood of losing their jobs in the next 12 months has increased by 2% to 13.8%, the highest percentage since April 2021. This percentage increases even more among respondents with a high school education or less and a family income below $50,000 per year. In other words, those who have less are seeing a more pessimistic future. Regarding household finances, the average American believes that their annual income will only increase by 2.9% in the next 12 months. This is the lowest expectation since July 2021, as people have consistently expected larger salary increases from that date until now. To make matters worse, the household spending growth expectation is 5.3%. This is significant because if the average person expects their income to grow by 2.9%, but their spending to increase by 5.3%, it means they will be able to buy fewer things, and their quality of life will be reduced. Considering this scenario, what is the Federal Reserve doing to combat inflation? Inflation is generated when the Federal Reserve prints too much money. During the pandemic, to provide all that money to people as mentioned earlier, they had to do it. The Federal Reserve has been steadily increasing the interest rate. However, if increasing the rate lowers inflation, why do they have to think so much about whether to increase it or not? Because increasing the rate also increases the risk of an economic crisis, since investors, instead of giving their money to companies, give it to the Federal Reserve. As we've shown, inflation in the United States is forcing people to dip into their savings or use credit cards to maintain their standard of living. To solve this, the Federal Reserve has to continue raising the interest rate, but this in turn brings them closer and closer to a crisis. The worst part is that this crisis would occur in a context where people have no savings and are too heavily indebted, so many millions of people wouldn't know how to survive. No one knows, but that reality depends on the decisions made now in a situation where the government and banks want to make it seem like everything is going perfectly. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please leave a comment. Also, please consider liking and subscribing. I would really appreciate it. Thanks.